Well, more now on the economic impact of Japan's crisis. Aaron, what does it mean for the country itself, first of all?
Well, we just saw those devastating pictures, and of course this is devastating for the short term for Japan's economy. I mean, we saw the market reaction today. It's the first day of business since, of course, the horrible earthquake and subsequent tsunami. And the Nikkei really took a battering. We were expecting that. In fact, we can bring the market board up and just take a look at the Nikkei at the top there, down 6.2%. This is despite, mind you, the Bank of Japan, the central bank there, injecting just over $180 billion into the markets, basically into capital, just to try and reassure markets. But again, the other point we have to stress is this is very, far too early to assess the damage, even though over the weekend they said the damage, they doubled the estimate, possibly to say $35 billion, but many saying that could go much higher.
What about the global impact of this?
Well, the global impact, I mean, we're already starting to see, for example, oil prices have dropped. Some will say that's a good sign, but it's not, because oil prices have dropped off the fact that 3 out of Japan's 5 biggest refineries have shut down. So that means less demand for oil. On the flip side, natural gas prices, advanced natural gas prices, have risen because with the power problems in Japan, they expect Japan to import more gas, and reinsurers and insurers around the world really taking hit because they're the ones who are going to have to fork out for the cleanup and the costs involved. I'll have a lot more on World Business Report very
shortly.
We'll see you then.
Thanks very much, Aaron. Thank you.
Well, a warning from the Japanese government that the shutdown of several nuclear reactors is likely to lead to a shortfall in electricity supplies. This, of course, because there was extensive damage to power plants. On top of that, we've had refineries and ports and pipelines really crippled much of the country's infrastructure. And millions of people are still without power in the northeast of Japan. And Tokyo Electric has warned of the country's first major blackouts for half a century. Mariko Oi now reports from Tokyo.
Fires burning out of control at an oil refinery near Sendai. The quake affected pipelines along the northeast coast. Authorities still aren't clear as to the full extent of the damage. Some ports remain closed. Deliveries of crude and LNG delayed. Everyone's worst nightmare. The first ever blast at a nuclear power plant in Japan. The failure of the cooling systems initiated a meltdown. Nuclear power is the biggest source of energy in Japan. It accounts for 29% of national supply, along with liquefied natural gas. Coal powers a quarter of the national grid. Oil and hydroelectric power make up a much smaller share. The aftermath of the quake has depleted the national power supply. Over the weekend, Tokyo Electric called for rolling blackouts for the first time since the end of the Second World War. This lift stopped working soon after the earthquake. Lots of people here and around Japan got stuck and were forced to take fire escapes. Right now, most lifts in Tokyo are working again. But the prospect of rolling blackouts means that people might have to get used to climbing stairs. "97 steps later, and this office is only on the 7th floor. In the city of skyscrapers like Tokyo, many people live and work in 30, 40, sometimes 50-story buildings.
I think we'll face food shortages. I am buying as much dry food as possible.
I haven't prepared much yet, but I hope it won't be a full blackout.
I have been unplugging all the appliances at home in order to save some energy.
Roppongi, famous for its bright lights. But soon they'll have to turn these neon signs off. And the Tokyo Tower, which normally illuminates the skyline, has been dimmed as a sign of respect to those who have lost their lives. Mariko Oi, BBC News, Tokyo.
And as we've been reporting, obviously the quake has also had an impact on shipping. Most of the ports remain shut, and reports also suggest it'll be days, if not weeks, before trade returns to normal. Well, Richard Meads is the editor of the shipping magazine Lloyd's List. He said it'll take some time to work out the full impact.
So I think there's some fairly dramatic pictures of the port of Sendai over the weekend, boxes strewn across the port, but sort of relatively speaking, that was a fairly small port in terms of Japan's imports and exports infrastructure. We're going to be really looking at Tokyo, Chiba, and a few of the other major ports to see how much they can import and export over the next few days.
So let's take a look at the market reaction. As I've been mentioning, Tokyo stock market plunge. Its real first business day since the earthquake and tsunami causing, well, the estimate's too early to say, but possibly up to around $35–40 billion. Other Asian markets mostly lower. Oil prices dropped to near $99 a barrel. That's after the disaster threatened to really send the world's third largest economy back into recession, crimping demand for crude. In currencies, the dollar was down against the yen and the euro, but you can see the Nikkei diving, what was it, 6.2%, really wiping out, I should say, the gains that we've made in 2011 there. Now, in Europe, got to say, though, a bit of a different story, partially, well, they're all a bit mixed now. They're gone south as well. That's all the time I have. Don't go anywhere. Sport Today coming up next. I'll see you real soon. Bye-bye.
Hello, welcome to World Business Report. I'm Jamie Robertson. Japan is now struggling to prevent the country's humanitarian disaster turning into an economic one. The Bank of Japan is pumping a record $180 billion of emergency funds into the country's financial system to provide liquidity for the banking system. The equity market, represented by the Tokyo Nikkei index, fell sharply. It ended the day more than 6% lower. Some of Japan's biggest companies, that includes the car maker Toyota, have shut down operations, not because of direct damage necessarily, but as the government introduces a program of rolling power cuts to ration electricity. Jeremy Howe reports.
Mass selling on the Tokyo Stock Exchange as investors tried to guess how badly Japan's major companies could be hit. The Nikkei closed down 6% on the day's trading. Firms like Toshiba, Toyota and Nissan have had to stop production because with 11 of Japan's 54 nuclear power stations out of action, they're running out of energy for their factories.
We've stopped production as of today. We're taking the opportunity now to assess how affected each operation is. Frankly, it's extraordinarily complex. It's not just that our factories, it's also our suppliers. Obviously, some of the suppliers are even within the exclusion area for the nuclear plants.
But it's insurance companies which have been hardest hit. It's estimated that the physical damage from the Japanese earthquake and tsunami will cost $51 billion to repair, and the total cost to the economy from that and lost production could total $99 billion. That would make this disaster about as costly as Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005.
One of the things that we know about the Japanese market is it does tend to keep a lot of its exposures within the domestic Japanese insurance market. So I think those guys will bear a brunt of it. But once it gets to a certain level, the losses will be shared out amongst the international community, and we'll see that the likes of the big European, the Swiss Re and the Munich Re's will pick up a chunk of it.
Damage to oil refineries has caused queues at the petrol pumps. There are empty shelves in the food stores, and the government says it will have to impose power cuts. The Bank of Japan is aware how badly all this could shake people's confidence in the economy, and it's injecting $184 billion into the money markets. It hopes banks will use this to lend to households and businesses when they come to rebuild following the disaster. Jeremy Howell, BBC News.
Well, let's get more on this from our business editor, Robert Peston. Robert, obviously a huge amount of money is going to have to be borrowed and spent in order to reconstruct the economy. Let's have a look at what the effect of spending the money is first, and then look at the effect on the debt. Spending the money first. I've read from some economists saying this actually could have quite a beneficial effect on a fairly stagnant economy up to now.
Well, I mean, it's sort of pretty, basic Keynesian economics that if you're going through a period where there's not enough demand from elsewhere, if the government starts to spend money, it can lift everything up a bit, as it were. And the great concern at the moment in Japan is, first of all, we've had a number of very important companies closing down plants. We don't yet know when those plants are going to be reopened. We are in for, at the moment, an unclear amount of time when there are going to be power cuts all around the country, which again is going to have an impact on industrial production. And there are legitimate fears that Japanese consumers, are going to be so shocked by all of this that they're just going to stop spending. So That's why economists are saying in the short term this is going to have a pretty negative effect on the economy, and there are some economists who think it could tip Japan back into recession. If the Japanese government authorises enough money to be spent on the reconstruction quickly enough, of course you would get a bounce back in growth relatively quickly.
So where's all the money going to come from to spend on this? Because their debt at the moment, is it over 200%?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think, look, the most striking thing about Japan as an economy in some ways is the sheer magnitude both of the national debt and of the annual deficit. Among the developed rich economies, it's got far and away the biggest national debt, well over 200% of GDP. On most institutions and analysis, I mean, you know, the IMF talks about a ratio of general government debt to GDP of something like 230%, which is a multiple of, you know, debt levels in places like the UK and the US. And the deficit at the moment is running at about 9% per annum. So before this happened, ratings agencies were warning that Japan's sovereign debt rating was going to be downgraded. Further, there were concerns being raised about the Japanese government's ability to borrow. Now, so, you know, the obvious question that gets posed is, where on earth, as you say, is all the money going to come from to pay for the reconstruction? Well, the rating agencies have signalled that, in a sense, that they won't do anything precipitate in terms of downgrading. I think they wouldn't be seen as particularly popular if they did that. But then one has to look at the very unusual way, compared to other countries like the UK and the US, very unusual way in which the Japanese government borrows. Unlike countries like the UK and the US, the Japanese citizens, Japanese institutions have been prepared to lend colossal sums to the Japanese government. That is where the borrowing comes from. Not overseas, not from financial institutions, but from domestic institutions and consumers.
They might be very keen to actually lend in a sort of gesture of national solidarity.
Well, I think that's right, Jamie. I mean, I think most people would say this is a country which has shown an extraordinary ability to pull together in crises, and in those circumstances there will be, I'm sure, a sort of patriotic case made for why typical Japanese people should continue to lend to fund the recovery. So I think it's too early to say that this appalling human tragedy is going to translate into a financial crisis, but I think it is as well to point out that, you know, the financial challenge for Japan is not a trivial one.
Okay. Robert, thanks very much indeed.
Mariko Oi has more now from Tokyo.
Desperate for the latest information, people here at Shinbashi Station are trying to find out the schedule for rolling blackouts. The Keihin Tohoku line, operating with reduced services. The announcement of planned power cuts prompted not just train operators, but many other firms to come up with a plan B. Companies like Sony, Canon, Toyota, Nissan and Nippon Steel have all suspended part of their operations.
For the manufacturing sector, their problem is that they have no sort of concrete schedule what's going to happen in the power supplies. Therefore, I think it takes longer, say it takes longer weeks or months, then it's getting in big trouble. But if it takes only a few days, probably the impact is limited.
The Bank of Japan is also doing its part. Governor Masaki Shirakawa announced a record cash injection into the money markets on Monday.
First of all, it is important to meet the cash needs of the people affected. The Bank of Japan and private banks will cooperate fully to make cash available, so we would like everyone to be reassured.
Now the focus is on the government. It's considering a supplementary budget, but that will put further pressure on its finances. Here in the heart of Tokyo's financial district, it is unusually quiet. Many people didn't make it to work, but those who did spent the day trying to assess the full implications of the earthquake. Many questions remain unanswered. How badly has the country's infrastructure been damaged? For how long will firms have to shut their operations? And when will supplies of important things like fuel and food resume? Until those uncertainties are resolved, we're likely to see more volatility on the markets. Mariko Oi, BBC News, Tokyo.